On the morning of August 12th, 1843, a woman's scream shattered the silence of Willowbrook Plantation in South Carolina's Low Country. What Catherine Hargrove witnessed in her husband's private quarters that morning would trigger a scandal so devastating that newspapers refused to print the details for 60 years. Within 3 days, over 300 citizens gathered in Beaufort's town square to witness a punishment so brutal that witnesses carried the memory to their graves. The county sealed all documents until 1923, and when historians finally opened them, they discovered the truth was far darker than any rumor. This was not just about betrayal. It was about the complete destruction of a man's soul, orchestrated by the one person who knew exactly how to weaponize an entire community's rage. Before we continue with the story of Willowbrook Plantation and the scandal that destroyed the Hargrove family, I need you to do something. If this story is already giving you chills, subscribe right now. We uncover the darkest true stories from America's past, the ones deliberately hidden from history. Tell me in the comments what state you are listening from. Are you close to where this nightmare unfolded? Hit subscribe, because what comes next is much worse. Now let me take you back to 1843, to a world where reputation meant everything, and losing it meant losing your existence. Beaufort, South Carolina, in the early 1840s, was built on contradictions. Spanish moss hung from ancient oaks like funeral shrouds, beautiful and suffocating. The air smelled of salt marsh and magnolia blossoms, sweetness that could not mask the underlying decay. This was where fortunes rose from fields worked by enslaved hands, where white-columned mansions competed for the most impressive display of wealth and power. The Hargrove family occupied the highest tier of this society. Edmund Hargrove, 35 years old in 1843, had inherited Willowbrook Plantation from his father 7 years earlier. 3,000 acres of prime land, a Greek Revival mansion completed in 1838, crystal chandeliers from France, heart pine floors so perfectly joined the seams were invisible. Edmund was exactly what a South Carolina gentleman should be, tall, dark-haired, broad-shouldered from years of riding. He dressed impeccably, spoke with the measured cadence of old money, served on the town council, held position as church deacon. He was known as a fair master, which in that time meant he did not whip his slaves as often as his neighbors. But Edmund Hargrove had a secret that would destroy everything. Catherine Hargrove, born Catherine Pemberton, had married Edmund in 1837. She came from Charleston wealth that rivaled the Hargroves. The marriage had been arranged, as most were, a union designed to strengthen both families. She was beautiful in the way Southern society demanded. Pale skin protected from sun, dark hair perfectly arranged, waist corseted to fashionable narrowness. She had been educated at Charleston's finest academy, trained in French, piano, watercolors, and the subtle art of managing a household while appearing to do nothing. Their wedding had been the social event of the season. 400 guests at St. Michael's Church. Everyone said they made a perfect couple. Everyone said their children would be beautiful. But 6 years into marriage, there were no children. This was whispered in parlors, always with that mixture of pity and judgment society reserved for women who failed their primary duty. Catherine felt the weight of those whispers. She saw Edmund's mother's thinly veiled disappointment. She knew her value diminished with each passing year. What Catherine did not fully understand was why there were no children, why Edmund came to her bed so rarely, why he seemed distant, his mind elsewhere even when his body was present. The truth lived in the quarters behind the main house. The truth had names: Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel. Marcus was 24, son of the plantation's head cook, light-skinned with features that hinted at mixed ancestry no one spoke of openly. He had worked in the main house since 15, first as footman, then as Edmund's personal valet. He was intelligent, able to anticipate needs before they were spoken, moving through the house like a shadow. Samuel was 26, working the stables. darker than Marcus, muscular from physical labor, with hands equally skilled at managing horses and repairing leather. He had quiet dignity, an inner strength slavery could not quite break. Edmund had noticed him 3 years earlier, begun finding reasons to visit the stables more frequently. Daniel was 21, a house carpenter skilled at detailed woodwork the plantation required. He was slight, almost delicate, with long fingers and an artist's eye. He rarely spoke, his voice soft and careful when he did. He had learned early that invisibility meant survival. Edmund had been careful, so very careful. He met them separately, never together, always late at night in the East Wing where Catherine never ventured. That section was supposedly being renovated, closed off, unused. Edmund had created a sanctuary there, a room with its own entrance from the gardens, simple but comfortable furnishings, a large bed, heavy curtains, a lock, oil lamps casting soft, forgiving light. For 3 years this arrangement continued. Edmund maintained his public persona perfectly. Church every Sunday. Business conducted with ruthless efficiency. Smiles at his wife across dinner tables. And late at night, while Catherine slept in her separate bedroom as was proper, Edmund descended the servants' stairs and crossed through darkened gardens to the East Wing, where one or more of the 3 men would be waiting. These men had no choice. They were property. When their master summoned them, they came. Whether they felt desire, fear, resignation, or complicated mixtures of all 3, their feelings were irrelevant. Survival meant compliance. Refusal meant punishment, sale, separation from family. So they came, when called, kept silent, told themselves they were at least safe from field work that broke other men's bodies, at least had slightly better food, slightly better clothing, small privileges Edmund granted in exchange for their silence and their bodies. But secrets, no matter how carefully guarded, reveal themselves eventually. In a house where dozens of enslaved people moved through shadows, where wives lay awake listening to creaking floorboards, where jealousies and resentments simmered beneath every interaction, a secret this big could only stay hidden so long. Catherine had noticed things, small things at first. Edmund always locking the East Wing door. Him seeming energized certain mornings, almost cheerful, after weeks of distant moodiness. Marcus moving through the house with particular tension, eyes never quite meeting hers. Samuel always in the garden late at night when he should be in the quarters. Daniel sometimes with bruises on his neck, marks that looked like they might be from fingers, from lips. She had noticed and pushed these observations away because the alternative was unthinkable. No southern gentleman would do such things. Impossible, unnatural, against God and nature and every law of civilized society. But Catherine was not a fool. She had been raised in a world where women learned to observe, to read subtle signs men thought they were hiding. 6 years as wife to an increasingly distant husband, enduring pitying looks and whispered conversations, feeling her worth diminish with each childless year. And slowly, like water seeping through foundation cracks, truth had begun penetrating her carefully maintained denial. On the night of August 11th, 1843, Catherine made a decision. She would know the truth. Whatever it was, however terrible, she would see it with her own eyes. Catherine waited until the house was dark and still. She heard Edmund's footsteps in the hallway, heard him descend the servants' stairs. She gave him 10 minutes, enough time to reach the East Wing, to settle in, to believe himself safe. Then she rose from her bed, wrapped a dark shawl around her white nightgown, and followed. The garden was illuminated only by quarter moon and faint glow from slave quarters. Catherine moved carefully, bare feet silent on brick paths. She could hear cicadas in trees, distant river sounds, her own heart pounding so hard she thought it might wake the entire plantation. She reached the East Wing. The side door was slightly ajar. Light flickered from within, casting shifting shadows. Catherine approached slowly, breath shallow, hands trembling. She looked through the gap in the door. The room was larger than expected, furnished with care that made clear this was no temporary arrangement. The bed dominated the space, covered in fine linens Catherine recognized as missing from household inventory. Oil lamps cast warm light across the scene. Edmund was on the bed, unclothed, his body intertwined with three others. Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel were with him, moving together in ways that left no doubt about what was happening. The sounds, the intimacy, the obvious familiarity of their movements spoke of ongoing, practiced, comfortable relationship. Catherine's hand flew to her mouth, stifling the scream rising in her throat. She stood frozen, unable to look away, unable to process what she was seeing. Her husband, the respectable planter, church deacon, pillar of society, engaging in acts that were not only illegal, but considered the deepest possible depravity. In 1843, South Carolina, what Catherine witnessed was a crime punishable by death. Not just for Edmund, but for Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel as well. The law made no distinction, showed no mercy. The act itself was called sodomy, though that word was rarely spoken aloud. It was considered abomination, sin so terrible that even discussing it could corrupt decent people. Catherine watched perhaps 30 seconds, though it felt like eternity. She watched Edmund kiss Marcus with tenderness she had never experienced in their marriage. She watched Samuel's hands move across Edmund's back with obvious familiarity. She watched Daniel whisper something that made Edmund laugh, genuine, unguarded laugh she had not heard in years. In that moment, watching her husband show more authentic emotion and desire with three enslaved men than he had ever shown with her, Catherine felt something cold and hard crystallize in her chest. Not just betrayal, though that was present. Not just humiliation, though she felt that too. What she felt was rage, pure, focused, calculating rage. She had given this man 6 years of her life, endured whispers and judgment, diminished herself trying to be the perfect wife. And all the while, he had been here, in this room with these men, living his true life while she lived a lie. Catherine backed away from the door, mind already racing. She returned to the house, climbed stairs to her room, sat at her writing desk. Her hands were steady now, breathing calm. She lit a candle and pulled out paper. She began to write 3 letters, one to Edmund's mother, one to Sheriff Charles Dunmore, one to Edmund himself. In each, she described what she had witnessed, sparing no necessary detail to convey the full horror. She sealed all 3 letters, then walked to Edmund's door and slid his letter underneath. She returned to her room and lay in bed, fully dressed, waiting for sunrise. Edmund found the letter at dawn. He picked it up, broke the seal, read. Color drained from his face. Hands began shaking. He read 3 times, as if repetition might change the words. Catherine had seen him. She knew everything. And she had already written to the sheriff and his mother. Edmund's first instinct was panic. Run. Saddle a horse. Ride north. Disappear. But where would he go? He was a plantation owner whose entire identity was tied to this land. He had no skills beyond managing enslaved labor and maintaining social position. Without Willowbrook, without the Hargrove name, he was nothing. His second instinct was denial. Perhaps he could convince Catherine she misunderstood. But even as these thoughts formed, he knew they were desperate and foolish. Catherine had described details proving beyond doubt she had witnessed exactly what she claimed. His third instinct was rage. How dare she threaten him? But that rage died quickly, because Edmund knew the truth. He had betrayed her, lived a lie, and in the rigid moral universe of antebellum South, what he had done was unforgivable. He walked to Catherine's bedroom and knocked. No answer. He tried the handle. Locked. He knocked again, harder. Catherine, we must talk, please. Her voice came from behind the door, calm and cold. There is nothing to discuss, Edmund. The letters have been sent. Sheriff Dunmore will arrive within the hour. Your mother shortly after. I suggest you use whatever time remains to make peace with God, since you will have no peace in this world. Edmund pressed his forehead against the door. Please, Catherine, I can explain. Explain how you have spent 3 years defiling yourself and your slaves. Explain how you have made mockery of our marriage and our name. There is no explanation that matters, Edmund. You are a sodomite. That is what you are. That is all you are. And everyone will know it by sunset. Sheriff Dunmore arrived at 7:30 with 2 deputies. Catherine met them at the door, still in nightclothes with wrapper thrown over. She invited them inside, offered coffee, explained the situation with calm, measured tone of woman reporting a property dispute. The sheriff was large, 60 years old, gray beard, eyes that had seen every variety of human wickedness. He had known Edmund since Edmund was a boy, attended the wedding, been guest at Christmas parties. As he listened to Catherine describe what she witnessed, as he read her detailed account, his face darkened with betrayal, mixed with disgust, mixed with cold determination of a man who knew exactly what the law required. These are serious charges, Mrs. Hargrove. The most serious a man can face in this state. I am aware, Sheriff, which is why I sent for you immediately. My husband is in his study. The 3 slaves he was with are in the quarters. I want them all arrested. I want this handled according to the full extent of the law. The sheriff nodded slowly. Where did this incident occur? The East Wing. There is a room there, furnished for this purpose. You will find everything exactly as I described. Sheriff Dunmore motioned to his deputies. They moved through the house with Catherine leading. She showed them the East Wing, the side door, the room itself. The bed was still unmade, lamps still burning low. Evidence of what occurred was everywhere, impossible to deny. The sheriff's jaw tightened. This was violation not just of law but of entire social order. Edmund Hargrove was one of the wealthiest men in the county, respected citizen, community leader. And now he would have to be destroyed, publicly and completely, because the alternative was to let such behavior stand unpunished, which would shake the very foundations of their society. Arrest Mr. Hargrove, the sheriff told his deputies. Bring him to town jail, then go to quarters and arrest the 3 slaves, Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel. The deputies moved to the study. Edmund did not resist. He stood when they entered, set down his glass, held out wrists for shackles. His face was blank, empty of expression. He looked at Catherine once as they led him past her in the hallway. She met his gaze without flinching. I hope you understand what you have done, Edmund said quietly. This will destroy you as much as it destroys me. Catherine smiled, a cold, terrible smile. I know exactly what I have done. I have revealed you for what you are. I will survive this, Edmund. I will return to Charleston, to my family. I will be the wronged wife, the innocent victim of your depravity. But you will be nothing. Just a name people whisper about, a cautionary tale, a warning about consequences of unnatural vice. Edmund said nothing more. Deputies led him outside to a waiting wagon. Within minutes, he was on his way to Beaufort Town Jail, shackled like common criminal. His fall from grace so sudden and complete, it seemed almost unreal. Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel were taken from quarters in chains. Their families watched in silent horror, understanding their loved ones were caught in something that would likely end in death. In 1843 South Carolina, slaves had no legal defense against such charges. If a white man claimed they participated in sodomy, their guilt was assumed. By noon, all 4 men were locked in separate cells. By evening, everyone in Beaufort knew. The news spread like wildfire, whispered in shops and parlors, discussed in horrified tones over dinners, debated in taverns. Edmund Hargrove, the respectable planter, was a sodomite, caught in the act with 3 male slaves. His wife had discovered him and reported him to law. The scandal was so enormous it dwarfed every other topic. Nothing else mattered except this one terrible revelation. The week between Edmund's arrest and his trial felt suspended in time, as if all Beaufort was holding its breath. The town had never experienced scandal of this magnitude. Murder they had seen. Theft, adultery, drunkenness, violence, all the usual sins had passed through the courthouse. But this was different. This touched something deeper and more terrifying. A violation so profound it threatened the very order of their world. Judge Howard Middleton presided over Beaufort County's legal proceedings. 68 years old, War of 1812 veteran, known for strict law interpretation and unwavering commitment to maintaining social order. When he received documents related to Edmund's arrest, he sat in chambers for over an hour, reading and rereading charges. He had known Edmund since childhood, signed the marriage license, approved loans for Willowbrook expansion. Now he was being asked to preside over Edmund's destruction. The law was clear. South Carolina statutes defined sodomy as the abominable crime against nature, prescribing punishment of either death or such lesser penalty as court deemed appropriate. Those statutes strongly implied death was preferred. No ambiguity, no room for interpretation. The act itself, if proven, demanded harshest consequences. But Judge Middleton faced complications. Edmund was white, wealthy, from founding family. Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel were enslaved, property, legally worth perhaps $800 each. Law theoretically applied equally, but in practice everyone knew enslaved people would be punished more severely and quickly. The question was how to handle Edmund without creating precedent that might threaten other wealthy white men with secrets they preferred hidden. On August 15th, Judge Middleton called private meeting. Present were Sheriff Dunmore, County Prosecutor Richard Fellows, 3 prominent citizens including mayor and 2 church deacons. Catherine was not invited, nor was anyone representing Edmund. "Gentlemen," the judge began, "we face situation requiring both justice and discretion. Charges against Mr. Hargrove are supported by unimpeachable evidence. His wife witnessed the crime directly. Physical evidence corroborates testimony. If this were any other man, any man of lesser standing, we would proceed directly to conviction and sentencing without hesitation. But it is not any other man." Mayor Thomas Pritchard interjected. "It is Edmund Hargrove. His family has been part of this community 3 generations. His plantation employs hundreds, directly or indirectly. If we execute him, what happens to his slaves? His property, the debts he owes and debts owed to him?" Prosecutor Fellows, thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, shook his head firmly. "With respect, Mayor, we cannot allow wealth or status considerations to interfere with justice. If we treat Mr. Hargrove differently than we would treat poor farmer or shopkeeper, we undermine entire foundation of law. Crime is same regardless of who commits it." "Fellows is right," Sheriff Dunmore added. "I have the man in my jail, 3 slaves who participated. If we let any escape justice, what message does that send? That wealthy can do whatever they wish? That law only applies to common folk?" Reverend Samuel Cartwright spoke, voice grave with moral certainty. "This is not merely legal matter, gentlemen. It is spiritual crisis. What Mr. Hargrove has done is abomination before God. It corrupts natural order, threatens moral foundation of our society. If we show mercy, soften punishment, we suggest such behavior is somehow forgivable. We cannot do that. We must not." Judge Middleton nodded slowly. "Then let me propose a course of action. We will hold trial. Present evidence, given circumstances, conviction is certain. But I will use discretion in sentencing. Mr. Hargrove will not be executed." The room erupted in objections, several men speaking at once. Judge raised hand for silence. "Hear me out. Death would be mercy for man in his position. Quick end, closed coffin, private burial. His family could mourn and move on. No, what I propose is worse than death. Public punishment of such severity that Edmund Hargrove will wish we had hanged him. Destroy not just his body but his soul, his reputation, his very identity. Make entire community witness it, so everyone understands exactly what happens to men who commit this crime." "What form would this punishment take?" Prosecutor asked. Judge Middleton's expression was cold, calculating. "The pillory and whipping post in town square, but not for hour or 2, for 3 full days. Locked in pillory from dawn to dusk, exposed to elements, insects, jeers and curses of anyone who passes. And at noon each day, public whipping. Not enough to kill him, but enough to scar permanently. enough to ensure for rest of his life he carries marks of shame on his body. Room fell silent. Even men most insistent on harsh punishment seemed taken aback by brutality of proposal. "And the slaves?" Reverend Cartwright asked quietly. "They will be hanged," Judge said without hesitation. "They are property who corrupted their master. They seduced him into depravity. They will serve as example of what happens when slaves step beyond their place." "Executions will precede Mr. Hargrove's punishment by 1 day, so he knows what his actions have cost them." Sheriff Dunmore frowned. "That is not just, Your Honor. By all accounts, Hargrove initiated these relationships. Slaves had no choice, could not refuse their master. Justice and necessity are not always aligned, Sheriff. Law requires all participants in sodomy be punished. More importantly, white citizens need to see natural order restored. White men may fall, but they fall from great height. Slaves who participate in such acts must be eliminated entirely. It is harsh, but only way to maintain control." Men exchanged glances. Slowly, reluctantly, they nodded agreement. Solution satisfied no one completely, but balanced competing demands of law, social hierarchy, and need to make example that would resonate far beyond Beaufort. But Judge Middleton had not factored in Catherine Hargrove. She was not present, but she had sources. One of Judge's clerks, young Benjamin Porter, courting Catherine's cousin, overheard conversation and repeated it to his fiancée, who immediately sent word to Catherine. When Catherine learned the plan, she was not satisfied. She had wanted Edmund destroyed, but had not considered Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel would be executed. Despite everything, despite her rage, she understood these 3 men had been trapped in an impossible situation. They were property, had no choice but to obey master's commands. To execute them for Edmund's depravity seemed like miscarriage of justice, even by twisted standards of slave society. But Catherine also understood something else. If Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel died before Edmund's public punishment, if they were hanged and buried before town witnessed Edmund's humiliation, then Edmund would become martyr of sorts. People would whisper he had loved his slaves, sacrificed himself for them, that there was something tragic and romantic about his fall. Catherine could not allow that narrative. She sent word to Judge Middleton requesting private meeting. He agreed, curious about what woman at Scandal Center could possibly want. They met in his chambers 2 days before trial. Catherine arrived, dressed in full mourning black, though no one had died. Deliberate choice, visual representation of death of her marriage, her hopes, her future. She sat across from Judge with perfect posture, hands folded, expression calm. "Your Honor, I have heard of your intended sentence for my husband and the 3 slaves involved in his crime." Judge raised eyebrow. "That was private discussion, Mrs. Hargrove. How did you come to know of it?" "In town this size, Your Honor, very little remains private long. But I am not here to question your authority or judgment. I am here to make request." "Speak, then." "I request punishment of all 4 men occur simultaneously, that Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel not be hanged separately, but be present during Edmund's 3 days in pillory and whipping, that they be forced to watch what becomes of the man who used them, and that Edmund be forced to watch their executions on final day, after his punishment is complete." Judge leaned back, studying her. "That is remarkably cruel, Mrs. Hargrove, even for wronged wife. My husband showed me no mercy, Your Honor, showed our marriage no respect, showed God's law no reverence. Why should I show him mercy now? Why should he be granted dignity of being punished alone, where he can imagine himself victim? Let him see what his desires have cost. Let him watch those 3 men die, knowing his actions brought them to gallows. Let entire town see complete picture of his depravity and its consequences." Judge Middleton was silent for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Your request is granted. I will modify sentence accordingly. Trial will proceed in 3 days. Punishment will begin day after verdict. It will be exactly as you described." Catherine stood, smoothed her black skirts, offered Judge Small cold smile. "Thank you, Your Honor. Justice should be complete. Entire story should be told. Nothing should be hidden. The trial began August 18th, 1843. Courtroom packed beyond capacity. People stood in aisles, crowded doorways, pressed against windows trying to hear every word. This was not just trial. It was social event of decade, spectacle that would be discussed and debated for years. Edmund was brought in wearing shackles. He had not been allowed to change clothes since arrest. Once fine shirt stained and wrinkled, face gaunt, eyes hollow. He looked like man who had already died inside, going through motions of living because he had no other choice. Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel were brought separately, also in chains, made to stand in courtroom corner, guarded by armed deputies. Their faces showed different emotions. Marcus looked resigned, almost peaceful, as if he had accepted what was coming. Samuel's jaw was set, eyes burning with quiet rage. Daniel was trembling, tears running silently down face. Judge Middleton took his seat. Prosecutor rose and presented charges. Then Catherine was called to testify. She walked to witness stand, with head held high. Wore dark gray now, still mourning colors but slightly less severe. Placed hand on Bible, swore to tell truth. Then, in clear, steady voice, described in exact detail what she had witnessed morning of August 12th. Courtroom was utterly silent as she spoke. Men shifted uncomfortably. Women fanned themselves, whether from heat or shock, impossible to say. Every word Catherine uttered was like hammer blow, destroying Edmund's reputation, dignity, very humanity. When she finished, prosecutor asked, "Mrs. Hargrove, is there any possibility you misunderstood what you saw?" "No, sir. No possibility of misunderstanding. What I witnessed was clear, unmistakable, and deliberate. My husband was engaged in active sodomy with 3 male slaves. He was not coerced, not confused. He was participating willingly and enthusiastically in acts that violate every law of God and man." Defense attorney young William Crawford, assigned to Edmund's case and clearly wishing he had not been, stood for cross-examination. "Mrs. Hargrove, is it possible your husband's behavior was result of temporary insanity, that he was not in right mind?" Catherine's eyes narrowed. "My husband has been engaging in this behavior for at least 3 years, Mr. Crawford. That is not temporary insanity. That is deliberate choice. That is who he is." Crawford tried few more questions, but each only made Edmund's situation worse. Finally sat down, defeated, no defense to be made, evidence overwhelming, witness unshakable. Edmund was asked if he wished to testify. He shook his head. What could he possibly say? Truth was undeniable. Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel were not allowed to testify. Slaves could not give evidence in court except in limited circumstances, and this was not one. Their guilt was assumed based on Catherine's testimony and physical evidence. They had no voice, no chance to explain or defend. Simply stood in corner, waiting for inevitable verdict. Judge Middleton addressed jury, though everyone knew their decision was predetermined. "Gentlemen of jury, you have heard testimony, seen evidence. Law is clear on this matter. Sodomy is crime of highest order, abomination that threatens moral fabric of our society. You must now determine whether accused are guilty of this crime." Jury deliberated less than 10 minutes. When they returned, foreman stood and delivered verdict. "We find defendant, Edmund Hargrove, guilty of sodomy." Murmur ran through courtroom. Some voices expressed satisfaction, others sounded shocked, even though outcome had been certain. "We find slaves Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel guilty of sodomy and of corrupting their master." This verdict delivered more quietly, almost as afterthought. 3 men's fate had never been in question. They were already dead in eyes of law. Jury simply made it official. Judge Middleton nodded. "Court accepts verdict. We will proceed to sentencing." He paused, letting tension build. Every person leaned forward, waiting to hear what punishment would be decreed. "Edmund Hargrove, you have been found guilty of abominable crime of sodomy. Law permits me to sentence you to death, and many believe that would be appropriate punishment. However, I believe death would be too merciful. You have violated not just law, but sacred trust of your position. Corrupted your slaves, abused authority, brought shame upon family and community. Edmund closed eyes, waiting for sentence to continue. Therefore, I sentence you to 3 days of public punishment. You will be locked in pillory in town square from dawn to dusk each day. At noon each day, you will receive 20 lashes with whip. You will be marked permanently, so for rest of your life, you carry evidence of your crime upon your body, and you will witness execution of 3 slaves whose lives you destroyed with your unnatural desires. Gasp went through courtroom. 3 days in pillory was brutal enough, but 60 lashes total would leave man scarred and broken. Forcing Edmund to watch executions was psychological torture many found excessive, even given severity of crime. As for Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel, Judge continued, turning to face 3 enslaved men, you are sentenced to death by hanging. Execution will take place in town square on afternoon of 3rd day of Edmund Hargrove's punishment, so he may witness consequences of corruption he brought upon you. Daniel collapsed. Deputies caught him before he hit floor, held him upright. Samuel's face remained impassive, but hands clenched into fists. Marcus looked directly at Edmund for first time since trial began, and expression on his face was not anger or fear. It was something worse. It was pity. Judge Middleton struck gavel. This court is adjourned. Sentence will be carried out beginning tomorrow at dawn. May God have mercy on all your souls. Courtroom erupted in conversation as people filed out. Some satisfied justice had been served, others disturbed by severity. Many already planning to attend public spectacle, drawn by morbid curiosity and knowledge they were about to witness something that had never happened in Beaufort before. Catherine left without looking at Edmund. She had achieved what she set out to do. Truth was public. Edmund was destroyed. She would soon be free to leave this place and never return. Morning came too quickly. Sun rose over Beaufort, casting golden light across town square. Already people were gathering, chairs set up for prominent citizens. Others stood in groups talking in low voices. Children were kept home, but teenagers and adults filled square until there was barely room to move. In center stood pillory, wooden frame with holes for head and hands, and beside it, whipping post, thick wooden pole with iron rings for securing condemned. Both had been freshly painted, as if someone wanted them to look their best for this historic occasion. At dawn, Edmund was brought from jail. He wore only trousers, torso bare, feet without shoes, hands bound behind back. Deputies led him to pillory and locked him in position, head and hands secured, body bent forward, completely immobilized. Morning sun was already hot. Within an hour, Edmund was sweating. Within 2 hours, flies had found him. Within 3 hours, his back was burning from sun exposure and legs shaking from strain of standing in one position. And people watched. Some jeered and called insults. Others simply stared in silence. Few felt pity, but kept it to themselves, knowing expressing sympathy for Sodomite would bring suspicion on their own character. Catherine arrived mid-morning, accompanied by 2 female relatives from Charleston, who had come to support her. She stood at distance from pillory, not close enough to speak to Edmund, but close enough that he could see her if he raised eyes. She wanted him to know she was there, witnessing his humiliation, ensuring it was complete. Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel had been brought from jail and forced to stand at square's edge, chained together, guarded by deputies. They watched Edmund's punishment with varying reactions. Marcus kept expression neutral, showing nothing. Samuel watched with grim satisfaction, glad to see man who used him now suffering. Daniel could not watch at all. He kept eyes on ground, unable to bear sight. At noon, real punishment began. Sheriff Dunmore approached pillory with long leather whip. Crowd fell silent, every eye fixed on scene about to unfold. Edmund Hargrove, Sheriff announced loud enough for everyone to hear, "You have been sentenced to 20 lashes. May this punishment serve as reminder of consequences of your crime, and as warning to any other man who might be tempted to follow your path. Edmund's body tensed. He had been whipped once as child, few strokes for childhood mischief, but that had been nothing compared to what was coming. He tried to prepare himself, but there was no preparing for this. First lash came without further warning. Leather strip cut across Edmund's bare back with crack that echoed across square. Edmund gasped, but did not cry out. Thin line of red appeared on his skin. Second lash followed quickly, then third. By fifth lash, Edmund was groaning with each blow. By 10th, he was crying out, unable to maintain composure. By 15th, he was sobbing, body shaking with each impact. Skin on back was torn in multiple places, blood running down to soak into waistband of trousers. 20th lash finally came. Edmund sagged in pillory, held upright only by wooden frame imprisoning him. Crowd was silent now. Initial excitement of witnessing punishment replaced by uncomfortable reality of watching human being broken. Sheriff Dunmore coiled whip and stepped back. Edmund would remain in pillory until sunset, still exposed, still suffering, but at least whipping was over for today. He drifted in and out of consciousness as afternoon stretched endlessly. People came and went, some staying hours, others just passing through to see spectacle with own eyes. Finally, as sun approached horizon, Sheriff returned. He unlocked pillory, and Edmund collapsed immediately, unable to stand. Deputies caught him, dragged him back to jail, where doctor had been ordered to examine him and ensure he would survive to endure next 2 days. Second day began exactly like first. Edmund brought out at dawn, locked in pillory, exposed to sun and insects and jeers of crowd. His back was massive scabbed lacerations from previous days' whipping. Every movement pulled at wounds, sending fresh waves of pain through body. Catherine returned as she had day before. She stood in her black dress, face shaded by parasol, watching without expression. People had begun whispering about her, calling her cruel, calling her vindictive. But they also understood her rage. She had been wronged in way few women could imagine. At noon, whipping began again. 20 more lashes across Edmund's already damaged back. This time he screamed from first blow. There was no dignity left, no strength to maintain composure. He screamed and begged and pleaded for mercy, but none came. Law had decreed 20 lashes, and 20 lashes he received. When it was over, Edmund's back looked like raw meat. Doctor would later comment he had never seen man whipped so severely survive. But Edmund did survive, though there were moments when he wished he had not. Third day arrived. Edmund was brought to pillory for final time. His body was barely recognizable. Back covered in blood-soaked bandages, face swollen from sun exposure and insect bites. Legs could barely support weight, but sentence was clear. 3 days in pillory, 3 sessions of whipping. Law would be fulfilled. Crowd that day was largest yet. Word had spread throughout county. People had traveled from neighboring towns to witness conclusion of Edmund Hargrove's punishment and execution of 3 slaves. Square was so packed that deputies had to form perimeter to keep crowd from pressing too close to pillory and gallows that had been erected overnight. Gallows were simple but effective, wooden platform with 3 nooses hanging from crossbeam. They had been positioned so Edmund, locked in pillory, would have clear view of executions. This was Catherine's final gift to her husband, knowledge that his desires had directly caused these men's deaths, and obligation to watch as they died. Final 20 lashes came at noon. Edmund barely reacted this time. He was beyond screaming, beyond begging. He simply endured, body jerking with each impact, blood flowing freely from reopened wounds. When whipping ended, he hung limply in pillory, more dead than alive. But he was conscious. That was important. Doctor had been instructed to keep him conscious no matter what, because he needed to witness what came next. At 2 o'clock in afternoon, Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel were brought from jail. They walked through crowd, chains clanking with each step. People fell silent as 3 men climbed steps to gallows platform. Minister, Reverend Cartwright, stood on platform, waiting. He held Bible and attempted to offer final prayers, but Daniel interrupted him. "Save your prayers, Reverend," Daniel said, voice surprisingly strong despite fear. "We do not need prayers from God who allowed this to happen. If there is God who sees what is happening here today and does nothing to stop it, then that God is no God at all." Reverend recoiled as if struck. "You blaspheme in your final moments?" "I speak truth in my final moments," Daniel replied. "Something no one else in this town seems capable of doing." Samuel spoke next, looking out at crowd. "You call us criminals, you call us corruptors, but we never had choice. When our master called us, we came. That is what slaves do. We survive however we can. And now you kill us to protect your own sense of order. Remember that. Remember what you did here today." Marcus said nothing. He simply looked at Edmund, still locked in pillory 20 feet away. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and something passed between them, some final acknowledgement of strange and terrible relationship they had shared. Executioner, man named John Kelly, who served as county's designated hangman, placed nooses around each man's neck. He adjusted them carefully, ensuring they would work as intended, then stepped back and waited for signal from Judge Middleton, who stood at base of gallows. Judge looked at pocket watch. At exactly 2:15 he nodded. Executioner pulled lever. Trapdoors beneath Marcus, Samuel and Daniel opened simultaneously. 3 men dropped, ropes went taut, and necks broke with audible cracks that carried across silent square. They died quickly at least. That was only mercy afforded them. Bodies swung gently in afternoon breeze, 3 men who had been property in life and remained property even in death. Edmund watched it all. He watched Marcus die. He watched Samuel die. He watched Daniel die. And something inside him broke that no amount of physical punishment could have broken. He made sound, low wailing cry that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside shattered soul, sound of anguish and despair and guilt that would haunt everyone who heard it for rest of their lives. Bodies were left hanging for hours, as was customary, to ensure death was complete and serve as final warning. Then they were cut down and loaded into wagon. They would be buried in unmarked graves on edge of town, in section reserved for criminals and slaves who died without family to claim them. Edmund was finally released from pillory at sunset. He collapsed immediately, had to be carried back to jail. Doctor examined him and declared he would survive, though recovery would be long and painful. Judge Middleton came to Edmund's cell that evening. He looked down at broken man lying on cot, barely conscious, covered in bandages, spirit as damaged as body. "Mr. Hargrove, you have served your sentence. You are free to go. But understand this. You are no longer welcome in Beaufort, no longer welcome anywhere in South Carolina. If you remain here, if you attempt to reclaim your property or position, you will find society has closed its doors permanently. My advice is to leave. Go west, go north, go anywhere but here, and pray no one where you land ever learns your name or history." Edmund said nothing. There was nothing to say. His life as he had known it was over. Everything he had been, everything he had worked for was gone. He was ghost now, living reminder of what happened to men who violated unwritten rules of Southern society. 3 days later, after enough recovery that he could stand and walk with assistance, Edmund left Beaufort. He took nothing but clothes on back, and small amount of money court had allowed him to keep from sale of possessions. Willowbrook Plantation was sold at auction to pay debts. Enslaved people, including Marcus's wife Rachel, were sold separately to various buyers throughout region. House was purchased by family from Charleston, who renamed it and tried to erase all connection to Hargrove name. Edmund disappeared into vastness of America. Some said he went to Texas. Others claimed he died within year, unable to survive without privilege and protection he had always known. Few whispered he went to California during Gold Rush, lost himself among thousands of other men running from their pasts. But no one knew for certain. Edmund Hargrove simply ceased to exist, as thoroughly as if he had been executed alongside Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel. Catherine returned to Charleston as she had planned. She resumed maiden name, Pemberton, and told everyone her husband had died. Incensed, this was true. Man she had married no longer existed. Her family welcomed her back, sympathetic to ordeal, understanding she had been innocent victim of monstrous deception. She never remarried. She lived quietly, managing inheritance, attending church, maintaining appearance of respectable widow. But people who knew her said something had changed in her eyes, something hard and cold that had not been there before. She had destroyed her husband completely, and in doing so, perhaps destroyed something in herself as well. Years passed. Scandal of Willowbrook Plantation faded from immediate memory, though it remained cautionary tale whispered to young men about consequences of unnatural vice. County documents remained sealed, as Judge Middleton had ordered, protecting reputations of families involved. But in 1897, 54 years after events occurred, something unexpected happened. Young historian named Thomas Bradford, researching antebellum South Carolina for his doctoral thesis, applied for access to sealed county records. After considerable debate, Judge granted permission, reasoning that enough time had passed, that everyone directly involved was long dead, that history deserved truth. Bradford spent 3 months reading through documents, trial transcripts, Catherine's testimony, letters between judge and various officials, eyewitness accounts of punishment and executions, medical reports on Edmund's condition, financial records of plantation sale. Everything had been meticulously preserved. Bradford was shocked by what he discovered, not just by events themselves, though those were disturbing enough, but by what documents revealed about antebellum society. Rigid moral codes enforced through spectacular public violence. Laws that made no distinction between willing participants and enslaved people who had no choice. Communities' eagerness to witness suffering, to participate in destruction of one of their own, when he violated social order. He published his findings in 1899 in academic journal with limited circulation. Article caused minor controversy among historians, but was largely ignored by general public. Story was too old, too disturbing, too at odds with romantic myths about Old South that were being promoted in that era. Then, in 1923, 80 years after scandal, Beaufort County finally opened all sealed documents to public. Local newspaper ran brief article about Hargrove case, presenting it as interesting historical curiosity. Article mentioned that Catherine Pemberton had lived until 1902, dying at age 87 in Charleston. That Edmund Hargrove's ultimate fate remained unknown. That descendants of Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel's families still lived in region, though most had never known full story of how their ancestors died. Article concluded with observation that seemed to miss entire point. It was different time, with different standards of morality and justice. We can only be grateful that we live in more enlightened era. But was it really so different? That was a question that haunted few people who truly understood story. Laws had changed, yes. Public executions were no longer permitted. Torture was no longer legal punishment. But human capacity for cruelty in service of maintaining social order, for using law to destroy those who threatened established hierarchies, for creating scapegoats and demanding blood sacrifices to appease collective fear and rage. Had any of that truly changed? In 2015, Small Historical Society in Beaufort erected marker near site where gallows had stood in 1843. Marker acknowledged that 3 enslaved men, Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel, last names unknown, had been executed on this spot for crimes that modern understanding recognized they could not have refused to commit. Marker called it injustice, called it tragedy, called it reminder of laws and social systems that valued property rights over human dignity. Marker said nothing about Edmund Hargrove, nothing about Catherine, nothing about 3 days in pillory or 60 lashes that left permanent scars. That part of story remained too uncomfortable, too complex, too resistant to simple moral lessons about past injustices. because Edmund was both perpetrator and victim. He had used his power to coerce enslaved men into sexual relationships, making him abuser regardless of his own desires. But he had also been destroyed by society that gave him no way to exist as who he truly was, forcing him to hide, to lie, to create secret room where he could be authentic for few stolen hours. Catherine was both victim and perpetrator. She had been genuinely wronged, trapped in loveless marriage, subjected to years of humiliation and judgment. But she had also orchestrated punishment of extraordinary cruelty, ensuring not just Edmund's physical destruction, but his psychological and spiritual annihilation. Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel were purest victims in story, men who had no choices, no power, no voice, who were used and then executed to maintain social order they had no role in creating. Their deaths were legal murder, sanctioned by courts and witnessed by hundreds who convinced themselves they were upholding justice and morality. And crowd, 347 citizens who gathered in Beaufort Town Square over 3 August days in 1843, who watched man being tortured and 3 men being hanged, who brought their families to witness, who jeered and threw things and called it righteousness. What were they? Were they monsters? Or were they ordinary people who had been taught that maintaining social order required spectacular violence, that some lives were worth less than others, that public suffering served higher purpose? These questions have no easy answers. History rarely does. What happened at Willowbrook Plantation and in Beaufort Town Square was not aberration. It was logical extension of laws and social systems that existed throughout antebellum South, throughout America, throughout human societies that build themselves on hierarchies of power and enforce those hierarchies through violence. Story remains disturbing not because it is so different from our world, but because it reveals uncomfortable truths about human nature, about how quickly compassion disappears when we are told that cruelty serves justice, about how easily we convince ourselves that destroying others protects our own safety and virtue. Edmund Hargrove, Catherine Pemberton, Marcus, Samuel, Daniel, Judge Middleton, Sheriff Dunmore, Reverend Cartwright, and 347 witnesses are all dead now. Their world is gone. But echoes of what they did, choices they made, violence they perpetrated or witnessed or endured, those echoes remain. Listen carefully and you can still hear them. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Or are there still secrets buried in Beaufort's past? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this dark tale from American history and want more stories like this, subscribe to hit that notification bell and share with someone who loves historical mysteries. See you in the next video, where we will uncover another forgotten nightmare from America's past.